All right. You guys asked for it, and you shall receive. Welcome to the channel, guys. Today I'm going to be doing the most anticipated video, I would have to say, probably on my channel, and that is showing off my PlayStation collection for all of you to see. Before I start this video, however, I would first like to thank all of you guys who commented on my last manga haul video asking and requesting that I show off my PlayStation collection and that it would be a really cool video to show off. So naturally, I couldn't put any of that hype down. I simply just said, you know what? Get some free time, let's go ahead and make a video showing off my PlayStation collection. And also, one more quick thing to note is that a lot of these games I have kept through my childhood. A lot of these games are the original games that I owned personally. I did not buy any of this stuff really on eBay. A few of these games, yes, but not all of them. That, and it's sort of a small collection. I have sold a lot of stuff throughout the years, so I don't have a lot of the games that I used to have growing up. I don't have Final Fantasy Tactics, I don't have Spyro, my original Final Fantasy IX copy. I'm missing a few RPGs. I'm missing Xenogear, Valkyrie Profile, a few others as well. But these are my main games. These are basically what I've had for the longest time and what I've maintained throughout the years in my collection. So hopefully you guys enjoy. Let's go ahead and get right into it. So first off, we have a fighting legend. We have the great, the awesome Tekken III. Personally, out of the original Tekken trilogy, this is probably my favorite. I really enjoyed Tekken 2, but Tekken 3 is hard to top just because of the amount of characters as well as the new mechanics that were introduced within Tekken 3. Still probably one of my favorite fighting games to date. Any of the other Tekken games maybe topping this one is a possibility. Tekken 7 was really great. But Tekken 3 was hard to beat. Hard to top Tekken 3. That's how great this game was. So, really hardcore fan of the Tekken franchise and one of my favorite fighting games on the original PlayStation. Next, Soul Blade, another fighting game on the PlayStation that is pretty notorious. Basically, Soul Blade is the spiritual predecessor to Soul Calibur, which we saw on both the Dreamcast and the GameCube and the Xbox and the PlayStation 2 and all of its glory, basically. So pretty much this is a weapon-based fighting game. You basically use swords and various weapon archetypes to defeat opponents in the ring, and you can knock your opponents out of the ring as well as defeat them with a traditional KO. Now, this is the beginning of the franchise, and it's a pretty dated fighter if you play it today. It definitely shows its age as well as its old school fighting game mechanics. But it's one of the first 3D fighting games, so I can't really give too much, I can't knock it too much. It's a fun fighting game. Do I think it's better than Soul Calibur? No, not by any means whatsoever do I think it's better than Soul Calibur. In fact, Soul Calibur is a better game by far. But it's a good fighting game. It's a good solo fighting game. This one has sort of become a little more uncommon, I guess you can say, for the PlayStation collectors out there. So if you can grab a hold of this game for a relatively cheap price, I want to say like maybe 20, 30 bucks, it's worth a shot. If you want to, check out the original predecessor to Soul Calibur, then this is definitely for you. So definitely one worth checking out. Next is Darkstone. And as far as I can tell, I've actually never played this game. I've played it, I think maybe once or twice, and it's a very just sort of over-the-top action RPG. It's not really that great. The graphics are pretty bad, and from what I remember, I didn't really like it. So I don't know if there's any Darkstone fans out there, but, it's an RPG, so why not? Next is Oddworld, Abe's Odyssey, or Abe's Exodus, not Odyssey. That is one of the games I am missing, though. This is the sequel to Abe's Odyssey. And it's an Oddworld game, so if you remember playing the first game in the franchise, then it's pretty similar to this. It's just the sequel to it. I'm not a huge fan of the Oddworld games. I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for that, but I never really found any sort of nostalgia for the game. I owned the game back in the day, and I played it, and it's, it's okay. It's nothing really too special. It's just your traditional 2D platformer with puzzles and other elements, as well as a very weird story. But other than that, it's interesting game. So yeah. And of course, it's a well, I think it's a one, I believe it's a one-disc game, but it just comes in the big oversized jewel case, as you can tell. Next is really a legend for a lot of first-person shooters, Medal of Honor. This is the very first Medal of Honor that came out for the PlayStation. From what I remember, a lot of my friends played the co-op, which is a two-player game, and it's a first-person shooter. You would think that this would be like four-player, but no, it's just a two-player game, unfortunately. It's okay, you know, it's Medal of Honor. If you've played the first 2, 3, 4, now it's no different from any other first-person shooter. Some people might argue with me that it revolutionized the first-person shooter genre. Others will say it's probably the best shooter of all time. I, on the other hand, don't really care. It's a okay first-person shooter. Final Fantasy VIII. Probably the worst Final Fantasy on the PlayStation, I would say. Just a lot of hype behind this one, and ultimately no promise or any sort of effort was put out on this one for me. A lot of people are going to be hating me in the comments for this, but I often consider this one of the top 5 worst Final Fantasy games out there for its story alone. Its story was terrible, its romance was awful, and ultimately the characters were just, they didn't do it for me. If the characters and the setting just don't interest me, then you basically lost me as a fan. The game itself was trying to be cutting edge by introducing 3D sprites, whereas Final Fantasy VII was still using pre-rendered backgrounds with 2D sprites, or 2.5D sprites. But yeah, Final Fantasy VIII, not really my cup of tea. A lot of people love this game, but I myself do not like this game at all. I think it's definitely one of the worst Final Fantasies in the franchise, other than, of course, 13 and so on and so forth. But we have our salvation, Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation, and boy, is this game a great game. I don't consider this to be my favorite Final Fantasy game, but I consider it to be one of the best looking, as well as the best Final Fantasy in the franchise. Top 10, definitely. Top 5, yeah, it potentially would be in my top 5 for best Final Fantasy. The characters really aren't that great in this game, but the setting and the environments, as well as the story, is what does it for me. Final Fantasy VII is going to be a really great remake. I'm going to enjoy seeing these games in 3D, or this game in particular in 3D with the various environments and going back. I mean, it's going to be really awesome, and so I can't wait for Final Fantasy VII to show off what it has to offer. It's going to be really awesome stuff. Next is Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped. This is the final trilogy of the Naughty Dog Crash Bandicoot games. Hang on, that came out wrong. This is the final installment in the Naughty Dog trilogy for Crash Bandicoot. I don't know why I said that in reverse. But anyways, this is Crash Bandicoot in its best. Solid 2D, 3D platforming, and also a really, you know, just chill, laid-back story with decent controls, and really just overall a really fun experience. I often have more memories with this game just because this was the first Crash Bandicoot game I ever played, and this is the one I was introduced to when I was a kid, so really happy to own this game, and really happy that I got a hold of this one. So, good stuff, good times. Next is Bushido Blade. This is yet another Squaresoft game. This is often considered to be one of the most unique fighting games, and sort of similar to Soul Edge, it is basically a weapons-based fighting game, except you don't win in the traditional KO. You win based on creating a deadly blow to your opponent. Meaning that if you, for some reason, you know, you're using a sword and you're able to strike your opponent down in the right spot, you will be able to win your fight. Now, battles I've seen go on for long periods of time professionally in the fighting genre. Matches could go for a very long time, and it definitely shows with this game. Now, this isn't what you would call the most diverse fighting game, but it's definitely one of the more unique fighting games because you don't traditionally win with a knockout, but you win with a deadly blow, which is awesome because you get to study not only weak points, but you get to study how you can potentially outsmart your opponent. And that is why the Bushido Blade series is so unique and really just notorious for being one of the greatest fighting games on the system. And none other by one of the greatest developers on the PlayStation, but Squaresoft, my God, made some really good games on this system, that's for sure. And necessarily, a sequel was imminent, Bushido Blade 2. More or less the same, but adding new characters to the mix. So if you played Bushido 1, you can play Bushido Blade 2. Ultimately, it is the same experience, just with more characters. So, again, solid stuff, really great. Grandia. Now this is, in fact, probably one of the few RPGs that I would land in any sort of top 25 list. Grandia is one of my favorite games for the sole purpose that the story as well as the gameplay are all great in their own mindset. I really enjoyed Grandia for what it had to offer as well as some of the stuff that the game had to introduce as well. Now, it originally came out on the PlayStation, but it received a release on the Sega Saturn only in Japan. And if I had to say, the Sega Saturn version is the better version. It runs smoother and it looks a little better. But the PlayStation version is just as good, so if you guys are wanting to get your experience with Grandia, highly recommend you do so. Also on the Dreamcast, Grandia 2 was released, and I consider that to be one of my favorite games as well. Do I think it's better than Grandia 1? That's sort of up in the air. I really enjoy both, but Grandia is really good. Now, I was going to have a game featured here, but I unfortunately do not have it. I was looking around and I can't find it for whatever reason, but Breath of Fire 3 is one of the games that I was going to show off. And I've owned this game since I was a kid, okay? For whatever reason, I can't find it. So you guys are just going to have to take my word on it. But I do own Breath of Fire 3, and I will show it in an update video if possible, that I do own it. Breath of Fire 3 is one of my favorite games of all time, okay? I'm slurring my words here for some reason, but I guess because of all the great games that I'm surrounded by, I can't help but do that. Breath of Fire 3 is one of my favorite games of all time, and here's why. Is mainly because of not only the great story, but the awesome RPG mechanics that are featured in the game. I really love the fact, not other than Capcom themselves created this masterpiece. And it's hard to say which one is my favorite, but Breath of Fire 3, I would say, is probably my favorite as of right now. I like Breath of Fire 4. I don't own it, but I love it. It's strangely enough. I'll get a copy one of these days, but Breath of Fire 4 is really good, but Breath of Fire 3 takes it for me. Really good stuff. Really love Breath of Fire 3. All right. Final Fantasy Anthology. And this here includes Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy IV, the two games that were never released outside of Japan. Of course, V was released over here, but under the name of Final Fantasy III. So it was kind of confusing for a lot of people. Or actually, I take that back. Not Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy VI was released over here. Of course, it was under the name of Final Fantasy III, and then Final Fantasy IV was also released over here, but it was Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy V was never released over here. Jesus, that's another convoluted sort of debacle right there. But anyways, Final Fantasy V is often one of the most mislooked games in the franchise, and for whatever reason, I have no idea why it is, but I consider it to be one of the best games of all time. Final Fantasy V is really good. Final Fantasy VI, probably one of the best games in the series. But honestly, this right here is the sole reason why a lot of people bought a PlayStation, was just because all of the re-releases of the Final Fantasy games, just about every single Final Fantasy was released on the PlayStation, and in these really cool collector's packages. I believe with this, it includes it includes a soundtrack of the Final Fantasy games, which is just in itself a great package in general. So if you guys are wanting to get your experience of Final Fantasy in, highly recommend that you guys check this game out. Really good stuff. Alright, a game that a lot of people will probably recognize is Revelations Persona. This is the first game in the Shin Megami Tensei series for Persona, and What started as Revelations Persona would later become just Persona. I personally consider this to be one of the best games in the franchise. Of course, it's one of the few games I've played in the franchise. I've played a little bit of Persona 2 and also played a fair bit of 3. Haven't touched 4. I know I'm missing out, but haven't had much time really to introduce myself to Persona 4 quite yet. But the first Persona is great in its own right. It's sort of a slow-paced RPG. It's very story-driven, which is sort of why I enjoy the game so much, because of the story. However, this game was heavily censored as well as changed and altered for North American gamers, mainly for whatever reason. I don't know why. They basically re-scripted characters, and they also took out certain pieces of dialogue and altered images in the game in order for it to fit for a North American audience. However, really the changes were unnecessary. And so a re-release of this game was basically made, and it was for the PSP. However, that has also become a very rare and hard to find game, just as this game has become very rare and hard to find. And so, what would I recommend that you guys do if you want the best experience? Well, I would say get the PlayStation version, but unfortunately, because it's so expensive and pretty rare and hard to find, if you can't find it, get a PSP and just play that version, because that is the definitive version. That's not uncut and uncensored. It is instead everything in its full glory. So, definitely, if you can find it, play it. Get it, for one, if you find it for a very cheap price, because it is a rare game. But, I'd recommend that you guys check out, maybe getting a PSP for that game. Next is Final Fantasy Chronicles, and I know earlier I said Final Fantasy IV. I meant to say Final Fantasy V and VI. I don't know why I confused it with that, but basically this includes Chrono Trigger and 4. Unfortunately, the definitive game on here, which isn't really unfortunate, is Chrono Trigger. It outshines Final Fantasy IV in a heartbeat. Not to say that Final Fantasy IV is a bad game. The job system in Final Fantasy IV is great. In fact, it reintroduces the great and fantastic job system from 3 and basically makes it even better. But Chrono Trigger, now we're talking here. I mean, not only does it have art assets from Akira Toriyama himself, the man and the legend behind Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, Chrono Trigger is one of my favorite RPGs of all time. And whether or not you agree or disagree, Chrono Cross is a good game. It's not Chrono Trigger, but it's a good game if you just look behind the fact that it is not it's not a direct sequel to Chrono Trigger. It's basically a different game in itself with a similar name, of course. But, my God, this game is amazing. Chrono Trigger is one of my favorite games of all time. Of course, it was released on the Super Nintendo, but it was given a re-release on the PlayStation with better assets as well as clearer graphics and a better soundtrack, in my personal opinion. So, good game, solid stuff. If you guys can snag this as well for a cheap price, highly recommend you guys just seek it out for Chrono Trigger itself. Final Fantasy IV is good, but it's nowhere near the level of Chrono Trigger. And Final Fantasy Origins. Now, I think out of all the re-releases, this is the one that no one really cares about the most because it has probably 2 of the worst Final Fantasy games on the system. Final Fantasy I is good, but it is aged poorly, and for that very reason, this game is sort of overlooked. Final Fantasy II is one of the worst Final Fantasy games. In fact, I would have to call it probably top 5 worst Final Fantasy games out there. The story is horrible, the leveling up system is bad in this game, the item as well as some of the things that they took away from the first Final Fantasy game are horrible. And often Final Fantasy II is the redhead stepchild of gaming. I mean, nobody likes Final Fantasy II, and I'm with them there because I hate it. But as a collector, you gotta get it, as a collector you gotta sort of put all your hatred aside and, give it a shot. And I did, and I hated it. So that's Final Fantasy II for ya. Ah, yes, the legend right here, Metal Gear Solid, the best game, I would have to say, definitively, in the franchise for Metal Gear. It's one of my personal favorites. I love Metal Gear 1. I think I like Metal Gear Solid 3 a little bit more, but This is definitely a tough one because I consider this to be one of the best games in the franchise, and rightfully so because the characters are great. The graphics for the time, while they have not aged well at all, are great. The Hollywood style of acting and just the voices that are carried throughout the game and the characters that you meet are great. Hideo Kojima is one of the best game designers of all time, and nothing can go past that because, as you can tell, his direction in this game was fantastic. Good stuff. Alright, we're getting close to the end here, guys, so Harvest Moon, Back to Nature. What a fantastic game this is. I'm a huge Harvest Moon fan. I'm not afraid to admit it. I have loved the Harvest Moon franchise, especially on the Nintendo 64, with Harvest Moon 64, which is pretty much this game. Back to Nature is essentially just a HD re-release of Harvest Moon 64 under a different name. And this game looks better and plays better than on the Nintendo 64, in my personal opinion. And ultimately, it's Harvest Moon greatness. So, can't overlook it. Cannot overlook it. So, highly recommend that you guys go and check this out. Alright, so we are reaching the end of the collection here. We have one more game to talk about, but before I get into that, I would just like to say that this game would need no introduction, but will also have to get an introduction because probably a lot of people have not heard about it. So, what I consider to be the greatest RPG of all time is not, in fact, a Final Fantasy game. In fact, it is a separate game from the Final Fantasy series, and it's not even a Square game. So, what it could potentially be on the system between Xenogears, Valkyrie Profile, Breath of Fire 3 and 4, Final Fantasy 7, Final Fantasy 9, Final Fantasy Tactics, Bushido Blade, just any Square game. It doesn't beat this. Suikoden 2. I have yet to find an RPG that can top the greatness that is Suikoden 2. It is basically if you took Game of Thrones and you threw it in with Final Fantasy and let's see what else. Game of Thrones, Final Fantasy, and just so many other RPGs that have drawn inspiration from this game. It's hard to say, but Suikoden 2, best game in the franchise, hands down, and made none other by Konami. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever see a sequel or a proper sequel or even a re-release of this game, but Suikoden 2 is by far one of my favorite games. Alright, so this video has gone on long enough. 22 minutes of just pure gaming greatness, and I'm sorry if you guys got bored, but Suikoden 2 is by far one of my favorite games of all time, and rightfully so. Anyways, guys, thank you all for watching. I'm glad that you guys really enjoyed, the response on my last manga haul video for wanting to see my PlayStation collection, and I'm glad that you guys requested it because I enjoyed talking about these games. So, thank you all for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and also, feel free to check out some of my other content, and most importantly, have a great day. Anyways, peace out.